So good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for a VIP case competition presentation on medical affairs. My name is Georgia Pappas, and I'm a first-year fellow at Merck in Global Medical Information through the Rutgers Fellowship Program. And I have David here with me tonight and Sona and Namosha to help monitor the chat and do some Q&A. So I'll go ahead and let them introduce themselves.
Hey everyone, my name is David. I'm also in Global Medical Affairs through the Rutgers University affiliation at Amicus Therapeutics, where I'm working in the rare disease space. First year fellow, I'm not sure if I said that or not.
All right, hi everyone, I'm Namosha Mohite. I'm one of the National Student Officers at IPHO, and I'm just supporting the VIP case competition as an NSO here.
Everyone, thanks for joining. My name is Sona. I am currently a first-year marketing fellow at Rev Health, and looking forward to hearing more about medical affairs. Thanks, Georgia and David.
All right, so tonight we'll be going into some general information about medical affairs, and then we'll incorporate that specifically into the VIP case competition. So we'll have time at the end for questions, but if you do have any questions throughout, feel free to just type it in the chat. So here are just some objectives listed for tonight. As many of you already know, medical affairs is a big umbrella term, so it has many sub-functions. So we'll get into the specific sub-functions, and then we'll explain how each functional area within medical affairs contributes to the company as a whole. Then we'll talk about the collaboration between medical affairs and other functional areas and describe the role of a pharmacist within these areas. Like I mentioned, these are some of the sub-functions that we'll be discussing. So here we have them listed, and we'll be going into each of them. So they are medical and scientific communications, medical publications, medical information, then field medical or the medical science liaison role, and then medical managed care.
Okay, so just a general overview of medical affairs. We can go next slide. As Georgia mentioned, there are a ton of different sub-functions within medical affairs. So it's kind of hard to give just one kind of, basic definition of what medical affairs does, because it's just enormous. And to make things even more complicated, a lot of the time the definitions for each role, differs between companies. So I created this little graphic here, which actually really helped me understand it a little bit better when I was doing my research for fellowship and everything. So the way I like to think about it is medical affairs is kind of this gateway or this road between clinical development and commercial. So Clin Dev is involved with information generation, right? Whether it's through early phase clinical trials or post-approval studies. And then medical affairs takes that information and kind of decides what happens to it. So, how do we use it internally? How do we use it externally? How do we get it out there to, key opinion leaders, which we'll get into in a little bit here. How do we portray it? We're kind of the medical face of the company. And then ultimately we support commercial, who then goes and promotes that information. And yeah, so we can go next slide. Perfect. So again, making sure that all the information is clinically and scientifically backed. That's really important. Making sure we're not making any false claims, because we can get in a lot of trouble with that. And that's how we kind of help support commercial. And then, when things are post-approved, generally we use our expertise to support those programs and the strategy behind that as well. I know I'm being a little bit vague here, but it's hard to be super specific, but we'll get into questions if you guys have any later. Next slide, Georgia. Okay, so so this is the slide for medical strategy, and each puzzle piece here is involved with that again, medical strategy, it's a little bit vague in terms of who is involved and how that goes between companies, but generally you're going to want to work with all the different functions within the graphic there. Next slide, please. I think that's just the same one. We got some, oh, here we go. Okay. So here's a term that you're probably going to hear a lot. It's called working cross-functionally. I know I've heard it a million times and it comes up in like all the brochures and everything, but the fact of the matter is that that's really just how it is. So whether you're, any puzzle piece on the board here, you're going to be working cross-functionally with one another to try to develop your strategy. And we have more on that to come as well. So I think, Georgia, this is where you take it away.
Yep. All right, so next we'll be getting into medical and scientific communications and medical publications. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with the process of creating abstracts, posters, and manuscripts. And I'm sure some of you are even familiar with the term communications agency. So a lot of the times the work done at an agency aligns very well with a pharmaceutical company. So I'm sure maybe even some of you had a rotation there, so you might know a little bit more about it. But just kind of getting into it, individuals within medical and scientific communications are responsible for directing and planning all drug-related publications, such as abstracts, posters, and manuscripts. And they really look at the timing of clinical trial data and ensure it aligns with the release of key data points at scientific meetings. So they really are looking to develop strategic plans around this idea. And they also ensure clear and consistent language is used to describe any type of clinical results. So as David had mentioned before, we want to make sure nothing is misleading and you want everything to be aligned just so. And then medical publications, that's involved with publication planning and tracking. So they're really involved with the direct creation of external communications, including abstracts for medical and scientific congresses, posters and slide decks, manuscripts, and these include both primary and post hoc. And they're also responsible for appraising medical and scientific literature with specific attention to strategic needs, but also ensuring that there's alignment with publication plans as well. So they work closely with internal statistical resources in order to develop and fine-tune analytical plans to meet publication strategic objectives. They also identify and engage key opinion leaders externally as authors for publication and abstract development. And they also ensure abstracts, posters, and manuscripts conform to high ethical standards and industry guidelines, kind of like what we mentioned before, as well as internal policies and procedures specific to a pharmaceutical company that they might be working with. All right, so in terms of disseminating information, in order to get to a publication plan, there are multiple things that someone in this area should have to ask themselves. And this would be, when will the relevant data be available? When should publications and press releases be scheduled? What publications are ideal? And what assistance can we provide to the paper's authors? So medical communications may also be part of a promotional review committee. So they really help out with legal, regulatory, and compliance teams to verify the accuracy of the clinical message that's developed by the brand team. So the range of permissible clinical messages is really limited by FDA-approved language in the package insert or the label. So I'm sure if you had a rotation or you know anything about regulatory affairs, you know that there's specific guidelines by the FDA that you can say certain things and you cannot say certain things. So it's really their job to make sure that this is continued to be aligned throughout any type of product development and any type of information that is put out by the pharmaceutical company. So medical affairs can really help ensure that the brand's messages are consistent with that insert. So medical affairs can also help verify product messages related to claims and findings that don't require FDA approval. So that would be health economics and any type of outcome analysis. So in addition to obvious misstatements and exaggerations, the team has to look at subtle issues as well. So that would be asking specific questions to themselves, such as, can we say our product has fewer or less serious side effects when comparing to a competing product without a head-to-head study? Or they also ask questions like, does this promotional piece present a fair balance of benefits and risks? So next we'll be covering medical information and the medical science liaison role. And this specifically talks about medical information. The main role of medical information is to provide medical or drug information. So a healthcare provider would do this and would provide information to either a consumer or another healthcare provider. It really depends on the company, it depends on the position, but it's often called an in-house role. So the individual is working at the company with this information. And we'll get into this more a little bit, but that would be opposed to something like a field-based role. And I'm sure you've heard this, in-house versus field-based. So a position that would be more field-based, that would be providing those that information to key opinion leaders out in the field. So that would be an MSL. We'll get further into that later. But medical information is in-house. So responsibilities are providing responses to unsolicited drug information requests. And like I mentioned, this is either from the consumer level or the healthcare provider level. They also support pharmaceutical reps and provide support at different medical meetings. They search and analyze literature and draft clinical responses and provide internal support such as different types of trainings. And there are some other responsibilities of medical information specialists as well that wasn't on the previous slide. And this could be company or position specific, but just some of the main ones would be medical meeting support, supporting pharmaceutical representatives, literature analysis, internal support. And internal support is kind of interesting because it depends on the company, but that would include developing presentations or medical or promotional review of scientific materials. In terms of literature analysis, we talked about answering those unsolicited requests to healthcare providers and consumers. Sometimes the medical information specialist needs to analyze literature in order to provide some additional information. So if the medical information department is involved in promotional review of materials that go out, literature analysis is often needed here as well. And in terms of internal support, this would be developing presentations for any type of trainings or for a general team purpose. And like I had mentioned a little bit about promotional review, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, but that means really anything that goes out. So whether that's a magazine ad or a TV commercial, or maybe it's the target's not the consumer, not being on TV, not in a magazine. Maybe it's the healthcare provider. Maybe it's a specific pamphlet related to decisions that they have to make as a provider. So anything promotional that goes out, it needs to be reviewed for medical and scientific accuracy before it does that. And I know, if you know anything about regulatory affairs, you know how strict the FDA is, and it's often talked about a lot, the FDA, what can we say, what will go by the FDA? But I think a lot of the times people don't realize that this information also has to be reviewed medically and scientifically as well. So it's really important that we're reviewing this material and ensuring that we're saying the proper things on behalf of the pharmaceutical company.
All right, and this brings us to medical science liaison, or the field medical team. And medical science liaison can be abbreviated as MSL. You'll hear that a lot. This is actually one of those kind of new up and coming, I guess it's not super new anymore, but it was relatively new and is actually a pretty popular career path for PharmDs specifically. You see a lot of PharmDs in the industry who, start in med affairs actually make it to MSL. So we'll spend a little bit of time here. And basically the goal of an MSL is to build scientific and professional relationships with healthcare professionals who are heavily involved and influential in your disease space. Generally those who either are involved in research or would be, directly involved with your medication upon approval. And so cultivating and maintaining these these relationships. And then also the other side of that is, you know, trying to gain insights from them to help form your strategy. And you'll hear me, you know, continually bring that up, because that's really important. Because a lot of people think that MSL is just, you know, kind of just educating everyone, which it is. It's a lot of external education within your territory, but it's also bringing back anything you can to help your company get a leg up and kind of, you know, drive the company forward from a strategic standpoint. And then another important thing that you need to do as an MSL, it should be a no-brainer, but you need to be very well versed in the clinical and scientific portion of your drug space. So, and that's not just your own products. Like you need to be up to date with all the literature that comes out on competitors, because you're going to have to answer questions on that when you go visit healthcare professionals in the field. And you heard me mention that you might have a territory or you have to go out into the field and talk to different healthcare professionals. And there's actually quite a bit of travel. And this slide, we have up to, you know, 60% or more involved with the job. So you're kind of on the move, you know, making as many interactions as you can. And we'll go to next slide. All right, so yeah, a lot of it is educating the healthcare professionals or the key opinion leaders in your space. You want to make sure that they have the most up-to-date and current information that's coming out, so that they can use that to, you know, shape either the guidelines or treat patients more effectively if the patients meet particular criteria, and on how you differentiate your medication from the competitors. Sometimes the MSL team will be involved with targeting certain healthcare professionals to become involved in clinical trials. You can also put together advisory boards, which is basically a panel of third-party KOLs. You're going to hear me say KOL a lot. Third-party KOLs to speak, whether it's, you know, on a panel at a congress, or, you know, in a webinar to discuss the disease space and some of the new data surrounding, you know, whether it be just the landscape in general or your medication. But yeah, this graphic kind of just goes into what we've talked about thus far. So you can go next slide, just a visual representation. So for the sake of time, I don't want to spend a ton of time reading all of these bullet points to you. But they're here for your reference, and you'll get the slides deck so you can go through it on your own. I want to make a couple of my own kind of key points between that discusses the differences between these areas. So we know that MSL and also MedInfo, they're both heavily involved in you know, education, information dissemination. So how do they really differ? Well, I like to think of MSL as being more kind of proactive. So you get the information and you want to get it out there to all these super influential people, people who deal with your, you know, your disease space on a daily basis, so that they can get the most up-to-date information on your medication. And then while at the same time, you're educating them and having really high-level scientific conversations, because you know the science like the back of your hand. And while you're having that conversation, you're trying to ask pointed questions that can help your company kind of form their strategy. Like, what are patient endpoints that are valued by these people? How can you use that to form future clinical trials to help give your medication an edge up versus your competitors? MedInfo is more reactive from my experience. I don't know, Georgia, if you have anything to add on what I'm about to say, but med information, generally you get a request from, it can be anywhere from someone taking the medication, a patient, all the way up to a healthcare professional who's asking about a particular, you know, is it safe in pregnant patients, something like that. And you get that information, or you get that request, and generally there's a call center that can deal with some of the more mundane, more, you know, frequently asked questions. But if they do get escalated past that to the point where the call center does not have the resources to answer those questions, it'll get escalated to the MedInfo team. And at that point, you can use data on file that maybe hasn't been published yet, or do a literary search, trying to come up with the best possible answer for the particular requester. And then one thing that I've actually gotten quite a bit is when I try to explain MSL to someone, they kind of bring up, oh, that's a drug rep, right? No, it's actually quite different from a drug rep or a pharmaceutical rep. Generally, drug reps, they're promotional. That's kind of their whole purpose. They want to promote it. They're bringing in, samples. They're trying to explain why it's the next best thing on the market, but they're actually very limited in what they can say. So drug reps have to stay on the prescribing information. They can't really go past the package insert. That's their script pretty much. Where MSLs, you're trained to know like everything in your space. All the data, the competitor data. You can go off label. You can discuss, it's just really a really high level conversation with the person that you're speaking to. And maybe in some cases, it's not necessarily even a healthcare provider. It could be other, healthcare professionals. So you have to also be able to adapt to your audience. All right, I think that's all I had on this slide. Okay, I tossed this slide in here because I know that some of the questions for the midpoint submission have to do with the dissemination of information. And so this slide deals with that kind of externally. So we just discussed MedInfo and MSL or field medical are kind of the two main functions that deal with this on a daily basis. And, we also just discussed it can be kind of reactive or proactive depending on the function. And not necessarily one is 100% the other, but just generally that's what I've seen. MSL is more proactive, MedInfo is more reactive. And then the timing of this dissemination should kind of align with the information as it's generated. So you want to be discussing with clinical development, when the information is going to be available and what would be the best way to get that out there. And that's also going to differ a little bit by company and a little bit by what your kind of strategy is. The MSL team is going to target KOLs or key opinion leaders externally to, get, like I said, get that information out as quick as possible. Try to, get a leg up, get the, I don't really want to say like influence them or get them on your side, but you want to have a high level conversation and explain why, why based on your data, you have the data and you know what claims can be supported by that, why it might make sense to use your medication over your competitor in certain circumstances. And then again, gathering strategic insights. I think another one of your questions was something along the lines of who are the KOLs, like who are you trying to target? And generally, we talked about it, healthcare professionals in your space, or even non-healthcare providers with high degrees, PhDs who are really involved in the science. That can also be beneficial. Next slide.
Yep. All right, so like David had mentioned about the slide before, I know some specific information for you guys is learning about internal stakeholder training. So really kind of look at it like, generally speaking, every time someone gets a job at a pharmaceutical company, or really anywhere if you actually think about it, you're trained for that specific role. So all internal stakeholders will receive a specific training aligned to their respective functional areas. And training requirements are different. It does depend on the company policy, and whatever that company policy is, that's how you'll be trained. But there is a role for individuals within medical information specifically to train other individuals within medical affairs. And this is fairly common, but within medical affairs, stakeholders in medical information train MSLs or the field on specific product information. So like David had mentioned more on the MSL role, they're experts on that product. And they're experts on multiple products within their area. And a lot of this comes from medical information, and it's their job to specifically train the MSLs on any product knowledge that they need going out into the fields. And this is, of course, the label and anything that they can say beyond that. And medical information also trains sales representatives. So this is more speaking to the label and other medical affairs stakeholders. So for example, this could even be someone in the call center. There's specific call center trainings that medical information can sometimes hold, targeting those medical information requests that you're going to see more frequently and kind of how to respond in what manner. All right, so next we're going to get into medical affairs in relation to drug development. So I'm sure you've all seen this before or something very similar to it on the drug development process. And it's
Did we lose Georgia there?
I was just about to text you. We might have.
Okay.
Here, let me let her know. I wasn't sure if it was on my end or on her end.
No worries. Well, I saw your screen moving still.
So
Okay. Let me see if I can pull it up fast. Oh, she might be back on.
Hey guys, sorry about that. I think my Zoom went out. Sorry about that. All right, I'll get it back. Technology, right? Okay, so I think this is where we left off. But from a clinical trial perspective, while medical information and medical affairs is not directly involved in the review, individuals within medical information need to analyze and use that data from clinical trials to provide information to consumers and healthcare providers. So let's say, there's a medical information request that you need to search into outside literature. You're going to really want to know those clinical trials so that you can provide the correct information to healthcare providers. So they also need to be up to date on the trials that are going on for a specific product. And this is because it helps determine how the product will continue forward in its life cycle. And then, like I mentioned before, we all know about FDA review. It's very, prominent in a pharmaceutical company. But materials reviewed by the FDA also need to be reviewed by individuals in medical affairs for scientific and medical accuracy. And I know I touched on this a little bit earlier, but this definitely ties into promotional review. So any type of materials going out to any audience, it needs to go through a review process. So same thing happens with the FDA and medical and scientific information as well. All right, so I know I also mentioned promotional review, but this is also in relation to launch. So same exact process. Essentially, in this situation with a launch, all materials are being created from scratch. So you're doing the same review process, but you're starting it all up for a specific product, all completely new. And then post-marketing. So individuals in medical affairs must keep up with the post-marketing data and clinical trials. So promotional review will continue to go out as the product lives on, and it must be reviewed by medical information. But post-marketing is really important because we can't just put a product out and say we're done. We definitely want to keep our eye on the changes that are happening with the product and really any changes to anything that appear in a post-marketing manner. So information that needs to be added or changed accordingly to how things are going. It's really important to know what's going on in these different trials and in this stage of the development. And just some qualifications for medical affairs. I know you guys, a lot of you probably know this, but you do need an advanced degree. So someone who's an MD, a PharmD, or a PhD. Therapeutic area experience is preferred, but of course you'll be trained as you enter the role. And it's good to have the clinical or industry experience. It's important to understand the roles and responsibilities of medical affairs and understand those FDA regulations and guidance. And more of a soft skill, excellent communication and interpersonal skills is critical because you are communicating with so many different individuals on a daily basis. And then just some strategies for career advancement. This is definitely having an expertise in a therapeutic area. If someone had, years experience working in a clinic or AM care setting, if they have a specific therapeutic area, that could really help them get a role within medical affairs. Also having leadership of cross-functional teams, people, budget management, and presentation skills, and a good advanced understanding of clinical trial regulations and also FDA regulations. And like David had mentioned, engagement with key opinion leaders as well. So this is just a little bit of a summary of what we talked about. We kind of dove into several different functional areas within medical affairs, such as medical and scientific communications, medical publications, medical information, and that field-based MSL role. So essentially the key takeaway from all of this is that each area plays a critical role in the overall success of the organization. All right, so next I'm going to turn it over to David. Oh, I think you're muted.
I'm back. Okay. Yes, so we created the rest of these slides just to kind of further supplement any questions you all might have when you're going through these, the Med Affairs questions. So these are just a couple of examples of how you would work cross-functionally with the other members on your case competition team who are working on the other questions. So you're going to have to interact with all of them. I would say most closely, you're going to want to interact with clinical development, just because they're the ones who are responsible for coming up with like the phase 1 through 3 clinical trial schedule. And so you need to be on the same page with them in terms of when the data should be available, when you can start, working on, training internally, external information dissemination. And I know some of these timelines are kind of arbitrary in terms of how you come up with them because you're essentially making it up, but it's still important to stay on the same page. You're going to interact with marketing. Again, remember you're kind of that gateway between clinical and marketing, making sure that the promotional material is supported from a medical standpoint, making sure it's accurate, and your marketing team isn't making any wild claims just to try to get a leg up that that aren't really supported. And then you are going to interact with the regulatory as well. It's important. You could have the best drug on the market, but if it doesn't get approved by regulatory agencies, it's not going to reach any patients. So making sure you're meeting the regulatory agency values, whether it's the FDA in the United States. I don't know if you're aiming for like a global launch and dealing with like the EMA or whatever. But that's kind of up to you to take it however you want to. Next slide. So a couple of recommendations. I would say try to make a clear timeline. I know we're a month or two into this already, but a timeline will help just so that you're on the same page with, especially clinical in terms of when you're getting that data and when you can start to answer the questions about how you disseminate the information. We briefly talked about creating a publication plan. That might be an interesting way to visually kind of show your team's thought process in terms of this. So food for thought, not necessary, but might be a good addition. And then there are a lot of FDA guidances, and the regulatory affairs is the function that deals with the FDA mostly, but they also have some information on medical affairs and some suggestions. So anything by the FDA is important, and it might help you. Maybe it won't help you specifically with this, but it'll help you learn a lot more, and you'll be more educated as a result and more informed when going into interviews and such. So that's ultimately the goal here, is to get into the industry. And then maybe the most important piece of information is to take a look at the competitor products. So the other products that are on the market right now, indicated for the treatment of eosinophilic asthma, because those are your competitors, and kind of seeing what they have done, you might be able to model certain aspects of your project after that. It'll make it even more realistic. Okay. All right. So what makes pharmacists suitable for a role in medical affairs? I think this is the last kind of question in the in the midpoint submission. And I might be biased, I don't know, because I'm in medical affairs, but it is probably the most logical place for a PharmD to end up in terms of the functional area. I mean, you're dealing with data, you're finding the clinical application for it, how it fits into the guidelines, what info is missing, and how you can fill that gap and try to form your strategy around that. So a lot of the things that you kind of are preparing for or have already gone through pharmacy school makes you like a pretty logical fit for a position here. And there's so many different functions within medical affairs that if that's your goal, you might be able to find something that you're interested in. Leadership and communication skills, that's going to be important anywhere you go. I'm sure through your APPEs and your IPPEs, you've whatever rotations you've done through your school, you've had to hone in your leadership and communication skills, and that's important in the industry as well. And then project management skills, I know you're definitely going through projects throughout pharmacy school, so it's just a kind of a good a good way to train up for a role in medical affairs going through pharmacy school. So yeah. And then just if you're completely stuck, you don't know where to go, I would say take a look at the homepage for Nucala or mepolizumab, because that's one of the meds that's approved for eosinophilic asthma. And that's kind of like the first line, not defense, but it's like the first thing that the general public will oftentimes see in terms of the medical information and how the company is handling that kind of breach, for lack of a better word. And I took a look on this homepage before putting it up here. I clicked around, and after like 2 minutes, I found a list of potential people who you might want to consider KOLs, maybe even people that GSK have already reached out to. So you can get a kind of a pretty good idea of who you want to be targeting as well in terms of your KOLs. And then I have also included a little link where you can look at an article published a few years ago, but it's still relevant in terms of the trends in medical information dissemination, because I know that's a big focus as well of the midpoint submission.
Okay, and this is a little bit more on our example that we provided. So David had talked about like the different key opinion leaders being targeted for the specific product. So once those healthcare providers and key opinion leaders are targeted, it's really important to demonstrate clinical efficacy and the place of the drug in therapy and why it would be so appropriate for their certain patient population. So again, I went through the website and I kind of was scrolling around, and these are a couple of things that I found. So in terms of clinical efficacy, something good, more like on a field medical side, would present different things such as clinical outcomes, real world evidence, and long-term data, things like this to help different key opinion leaders and healthcare providers make a decision about a drug and its place in therapy. And kind of touching a little bit more on the in-house medical information side of things, again, providing evidence-based information in response to medical information requests. So you see this number here, it says GSK medical information, and that number is their medical information line to the call center. So it's very common that medical information departments have call centers. So someone in medical information on this product would most likely be getting those calls from either consumers or providers, asking specific questions related to the product in order to help them make decisions. And again, just a review, reviewing promotional materials is really important regardless at the point in the life cycle of the drug, all the way from launch, all the way till way after the drug's out. Promotional materials is still an integral part of the whole advertising and medical affairs process. Okay, so I think that's all we have for today. Thank you guys so much for attending this event. and we'd be really happy to answer any questions you have.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it. We do have a few questions on the line. So one geared a little bit more towards off-label information and what MSLs can and can't say. So I think it would be nice to kind of hear, can MSLs say, off-label information compared to perhaps promotional team or sales reps? So I think a little more explanation on that would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. So MSLs can go off-label. Generally, that's reserved for healthcare professionals, people that they have developed those relationships with, some of the key opinion leaders. Oftentimes, if a patient is asking for that kind of information, we would just redirect them to their primary care, or whoever they're seeing, whoever prescribed the medication, to kind of handle that. The restriction on what MSLs can say is like what's medically and scientifically accurate. You might not go in guns blazing with every single off-label thing because it might be too much, but try to, if you have a new paper that just got published and there was some off-label data there, you can go over that with the healthcare provider or the KOL or whatever, and kind of discuss, because the indication, I'm trying to formulate my thought here. It kind of hits home for me because one of the medications that I work on a daily basis is indicated for one particular set of criteria, and the FDA didn't take like this whole other endpoint that we went over. So this whole other endpoint, which we have really awesome data for in terms of like outcomes from a cardiac standpoint, that's what it is. The FDA just decided not to take it because that wasn't really measured in the gold standard. But we try to communicate that information as much as we can. So things that really kind of help your medication stand out are things that you want to be going over.
Perfect, thank you. Another question is a little bit more geared towards actually obtaining an MSL position. And so one student is asking, have you noticed that MSLs are only hired after about 5 years of experience? Or can you just get a fellowship and maybe just get the MSL position right out?
Yeah, so I know that generally speaking, they like to see some clinical experience, whether that be doing your residency and going practicing like within a hospital. I know that's a really easy transition actually, because you're so well versed in like a particular, say you specialize in like pulmonology, then you would be a great transition for a company that's working in this disease space that the case competition is on, because you're working with that every day. I know that there are fellowship opportunities that actually expose you to MSL opportunities. So my fellowship actually near the end of this year, I'll be rotating in the field. And the whole second year of mine is with an MSL focus. And I might actually even like be able to have a territory during that, which would be really exciting. So it's not required. The fellowship is seen as like a really valuable experience to hone not necessarily your clinical expertise from what you would get if you worked in a hospital for a few years, but all the other soft skills that are kind of really required to be an MSL, and then you get that clinical training on the job.
Georgia, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, David, you did a really nice job and covered that well. I think this kind of point goes for anything in industry, and it's really good to just keep in mind that everyone's path is a little bit different, and it's not always so clear cut. If you do this, I'm going to be an MSL in 5 years. If I do this, I'll be an MSL in 3 years. Like, it's not so clear cut for everyone, and it is a little bit different. So I definitely agree with what David said. And sometimes one of my professors during pharmacy school, he was in endocrinology, and he was there for so long, and he just recently left to become an MSL. And some people were like, what, like, how'd that happen? But it's true. If you have a clinical expertise for a very long time, you can definitely be a really good candidate for that role. And then, like David also mentioned, there are specific fellowships geared toward the field and MSL roles. And I think those are designed to really, hone in your focus and really try to stay on that track if that is what you're really interested in. So it really does depend on the situation. It can differ. But at the end of the day, no one's path is exactly the same, and people have different ways of getting in.
That was a really good way to put it.
It was. Perfect. Thanks, guys. And then another question is, are there any other professionals besides just MDs or PhDs that you see as KOLs? Have you ever seen any like PharmDs act as KOLs or anyone else?
It's a really good question.
I thought so too.
I'm sure that there are PharmDs who are KOLs. A big part of it is whether or not you're actually, I'm not gonna explain too much about it because I want you to look it up, because this might actually help you in terms of one of your questions. I don't want to give you the answer, but I'll give you a place to start. So when you're trying to identify your KOLs, if you want to get really specific into it, you might come up with some criteria in terms of who you would want to target. So, obviously, if you're going for a US launch, you want US KOLs, right? So that would be one easy criteria to select. Then you might look into, okay, how many patients does this person see on average? Or does this person, how many publications does this person have? Are they involved in the research, the most current research here? Because there are a lot of KOLs who you would target based on their scientific, based on their publications, and you would actually try to get them to do some of your trials if you could. I had one other thing I wanted to say, but I'm blanking on it now. But basically, try to come up with a criteria if you wanted to really go above and beyond on how you would try to select KOLs who would be most influential. I'm sure there are PharmD KOLs.
I've actually never heard of any, so that'll be interesting. Perfect. Thanks, guys. And another question.
I'll let you guys, I'll circle back in a year. I'll let you know if I run into any.
Please. Another question we have is, once you've actually determined who your KOL is, how do you go about approaching them to be on your team?
Yeah, so you're trying to cultivate this professional relationship with them, right? It should be to the point where you're able to have some small talk. It should be really kind of casual at the end, where you're able to chat with these people. And if they've done, types of, similar types of research in the past, maybe you could pose the question to them. And then in other cases, sometimes, obviously, there are a ton of healthcare professionals out there. Maybe you would just reach out via email to everyone and kind of just see who you get. But you might want to target some others in person if you think they would be a really good fit. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything else to add on that, Georgia.
Sure. Yep. No, I think that was that pretty much covered it. I just want to also bring up the term field ride. I don't know if you guys have heard of a field ride or a field visit, but a lot of times the purpose of those field rides or field visits is to go out in the field and to actually go in person and target those key opinion leaders. So that is a way also, like David mentioned, you can reach out via email or other electronic forms of communication, but going to visit them in person and, actually showing up is a big part of the job.
Good, thanks. And then Georgia, I think you touched on this a little bit, but if we could further clarify what you mean by publication plan and how exactly medical affairs plays a role in that.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let's say you have a different poster or manuscript, anything like those types of materials. You, as a communications agency or scientific communications, a lot of the times, if you kind of think about it like launching a drug in a pharmaceutical company, right? You launch a drug, you have plans like we're going to say, okay, by February, we want to be here. We want to make sure that this information is out. By this point, we want this to happen. And by this point, we want it launched. So they have that plan, right, at a pharmaceutical company. So I'm going to say this first because this might make it easier to relate. So a scientific communications agency or anyone else involved in medical publications, that's like putting out, instead of a drug, it would be putting out information like a poster, an abstract, or really anything. Like if you guys are involved in mid-year and putting out a poster yourself to kind of make it relatable, that might be a good way to think of it. But that's a publication plan. So thinking, all right, what information do we need to get by this point to be this far in our plan? And can we actually submit this at this timeline to actually put out our poster or put out our manuscript? So I think that's a little bit more on publication planning.
Perfect. Thanks, Georgia. And the last question I see here is, how do MSLs utilize and communicate evidence-based information? This might be a little tricky. And also, I think it kind of relays into some of the questions for your competition. So definitely try to be a little broad so you guys can kind of think on your own for this one too.
Yep. I know, I'm trying to make it a little broad.
Sorry.
It's okay. I guess if you think about it, if you're an MSL and you want to go to that physician's office, how are you going to get that information to them, right? Like, are you just going to say it? Are you going to show it? Like, those are some things to think about to kind of keep it a little bit broad, but keep in mind too, a lot of times like MSLs do have different presentations that they do give. Without saying too much, that is a way to communicate, and that is a way like using PowerPoints to present. I guess I'll just leave that with you, and I don't really know what else.
I see in the chat here, someone mentioned that they had an experience with an MSL who threw like a lunch and learn, which is actually fairly common. I didn't, when I was doing like my rotations in a hospital, I didn't actually have any MSLs. We had a lot of reps come through. We didn't see any MSLs, but that could be an option as well.
Yep, that's definitely a good point. And I don't know if you guys have heard of like having dinners or lunches or different things. A lot of times that relationship continues over, time, and that's something that MSLs tend to do with the different key opinion leaders.
You got to be a little careful with that. Make sure that you're not, overspending. There's a whole bunch of regulations about how much money you can give to like the lunch or whatever.
Yep. I know, you wouldn't even think of it, but like I didn't really know so much about the different money spending. Like I didn't know that before until I started my fellowship, and I had a training on it, and I'm like, you can't spend this much because it's funny. It's interesting. Definitely a good point.
You're trying to get them on your side, but like you can't have a conflict of interest where you like, oh, we're gonna buy you a car, so promote it. Like you can't do that. That's obviously an extreme case, but.
Perfect. I think that's all the questions we have. Feel free to send us your questions to the VIP Case competition email. But this, just as a reminder, these slides and the recording will be put up on the IPHO website. Of course, we'll send it out to your key person for each chapter. But again, thank you so much, David and Georgia. I really appreciate it. I definitely learned a lot as well, and I hope all of you guys did too. So have a good evening. And just a reminder, in 2 weeks, we'll be having the marketing and HEOR webinar as well. So definitely stay tuned for that. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.